It was just another ordinary day in my life. I woke up early, just as the sun was rising, and went through my usual morning routine. The house was quiet, a peaceful silence that I preferred, the kind of tranquility that let me gather my thoughts for the day. After brushing up, I grabbed my cup of coffee, then leaned over and kissed my wife, Hannah, goodbye as she slept soundly, her face still half hidden in the pillow. I left the house, hopped into my truck, and made my way to the construction site where I worked. Routine was my thing. It kept everything predictable, comfortable, stable. Little did I know, this day would prove that routine can hide the cracks that are only exposed when something big happens to knock them loose. My phone buzzed around mid-morning. It was a message from my neighbor Joe. "Hey Nick, your garage door is open." My brow furrowed. I distinctly remembered closing it before I left. Maybe it's nothing, I thought. Maybe the door didn't shut properly or the wind had played a part. Still, something gnawed at me. I didn't like the idea of leaving the door open for anyone to wander in. I replied to Joe, asking him to close it for me, and he agreed. But even after I went back to work, the feeling of unease lingered. Something about it just didn't sit right. By lunchtime, I couldn't shake the thought. I couldn't focus on the work in front of me. The thought of that open garage door buzzed in the back of my mind. I didn't even know why it was bothering me so much, but it was. It had me on edge. Finally, I couldn't take it any longer. I needed to go check it out. I told my foreman I'd be stepping out for an early lunch and headed home. As I drove down my street, the feeling of dread grew, expanding in my chest like a heavy weight. Then, I saw it. An unfamiliar black sedan parked in my driveway. My heart dropped. It wasn't the plumber, it wasn't Amazon. It was someone I didn't recognize. My gut twisted into a knot. I parked down the street, away from the house, and decided to approach quietly. I walked toward the side door that led into the garage. When I reached for the handle, it turned easily in my hand. It wasn't locked. My suspicions flared up, sharper now, more urgent. I crept through the door, feeling like the world was holding its breath. The air inside felt wrong, stale, too still. As I slipped inside, I took off my shoes, moving as silently as I could. My pulse thundered in my ears as I moved toward the stairs leading to the bedroom. The muffled sound of something upstairs made my heart skip a beat, freezing me for a moment. I didn't know what it was, but instinct screamed at me to stay quiet. And then it happened. I reached the top of the stairs and caught the unmistakable sound of my wife's moans. And there she was, Hannah, on all fours, the sheets tangled beneath her, her flushed face buried in a pillow. On top of her was a man I didn't recognize, his hand gripping her waist tightly, his body pounding into hers as he slapped her ass between thrusts. It was happening right there, in our bed, in a place we had shared so many intimate moments together. The shock hit me like a tidal wave, but I didn't move. I just stood there, frozen. I wanted to scream. I wanted to barge in, flip the bed over, and break them both. But I didn't. My body, stunned, didn't let me act in anger. I simply pulled out my phone, turning off the flash, and took a few pictures. The video was next. His hairy back. Her face, contorted in ecstasy. The sheets, the same ones we picked out together. Every single detail was burned into my mind. I stood there, silently, processing everything. Then, once the wave of nausea hit me, once the humiliation and rage crashed over me, I knew what I had to do. They were going to pay for this. I wasn't going to storm in and act on my temper, no. I would play this smart, cold, and calculated. I would make sure they regretted this. I walked back to my truck, the initial shock fading into something far more dangerous. Clarity. I sat in the truck for a while, staring at the photos and video on my phone, evidence not just for me but for anyone who might doubt my next move. I wasn't about to let this go, not like this. The first call I made was to Dave, an old friend who happened to be a lawyer. "Hey, Dave, got a minute? I've got a situation." Dave's voice dropped into lawyer mode immediately. "What kind of situation?" "The kind where I came home to find my wife screwing some guy in our bed." "Jesus Christ, Nick," he sighed, then continued, "All right. What do you need from me?" "I need guidance. We're in South Carolina. What's my best play here?" Dave took a breath. "Lucky for you, South Carolina is one of the few states that still takes adultery seriously in divorce cases. You've got the evidence, pictures and video. I'll meet you tomorrow, and we'll talk options. In the meantime, don't confront her. Play it cool. She can't know what's coming. I hung up the phone, forcing my anger back down. This wasn't about revenge in the heat of the moment. This was about playing it smart. When the time came, I would be the one standing tall, while they were left in the wreckage of their choices. The next day, I met with a divorce lawyer named Laura Perkins, someone Dave had highly recommended. She was known for being ruthless in court, the kind of lawyer you wanted on your side when things got ugly. When I laid it all out for her, the open garage, the strange car, the betrayal, I handed her my phone. She didn't flinch. She scrolled through the photos and video with a detached professionalism, as if she'd seen it all before. When she finished, she set the phone down and looked at me. Nick, you've got a strong case. South Carolina courts don't take adultery lightly. If we play this right, you'll walk away with minimal losses, maybe even advantages. She gave a small, predatory smile. And Hannah, she won't know what hit her. That was all I needed to hear. Over the next few days, I began putting my plan into motion. I rented a cheap apartment on the other side of the city and moved some of my things there. Technically, the house belonged to Hannah's parents, so I wasn't leaving behind anything I cared about. What mattered was ensuring I had a clean slate when the time came. Meanwhile, Hannah was blissfully unaware. She still texted me like everything was normal, checking in about work, asking if I could pick up milk on the way home. The audacity was almost laughable, but I played along, responding with short, neutral messages. No need to give anything away yet. When everything was in place, Laura and I arranged a meeting with Hannah. We met her at a local cafe. The look on her face when she walked in and saw me sitting there with my lawyer was priceless. She slid into the booth across from us, her eyes darting nervously between me and Laura. "What's going on, Nick?" she asked, her voice trembling just enough to make me smile inside. I didn't respond. Instead, I slid the divorce papers across the table, letting them sit in front of her. She picked them up, and the color drained from her face. "Nick, I don't understand." "Don't play dumb, Hannah," I said, my voice calm but razor-sharp. I saw you with him in our bed." Her face went pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. That's when Laura stepped in, her voice cool and commanding. "You've been served, Mrs." Nick had been patient throughout the whole process, though he knew what was coming. The papers on the table were the final step. "Carter," he said, his voice low but stern, "I suggest you review the terms carefully. Refusing to sign won't stop this process. It'll just make it messier for you." Hannah's hands trembled as she clutched the divorce papers, a faint trace of guilt crossing her face. "I'm sorry," she began, but Nick interrupted her before she could finish. "I don't want your apologies. I just want you out of my life," he said, his tone cold, emotionless. Tears welled up in her eyes, but Nick couldn't find it in himself to feel sympathy for her. She had created this mess, and now she had to deal with the consequences. Hannah didn't sign the divorce papers right away, though. Of course, she didn't. People like her never took responsibility for their actions unless someone made them. By the time she finally came around, Nick was already out of the house and making preparations to secure his future. He knew that her hesitation wouldn't change anything, but it would only drag things out longer. Days passed, and then he received word that her parents had stepped in. Apparently, they had agreed to pay for her lawyer. It didn't surprise him. Her parents were old money, the type who always came to her rescue when things went wrong. What they didn't know, though, was the real reason Hannah needed a lawyer in the first place. Nick took matters into his own hands. He compiled a package for her parents, a USB drive with incriminating photos and videos, accompanied by a short, direct letter. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Jennings, I understand you've chosen to support Hannah in this matter, which is your right. However, I believe it's only fair that you know the full story before proceeding. The attached file should clarify the reasons behind my decision to file for divorce. Sincerely, Nick." The fallout came quickly. Later that day, Hannah called him, sobbing and furious. "How could you show that to my parents?" she screamed, her voice thick with anger and embarrassment. Nick's response was cold and unwavering. "They deserve to know who they're backing. He paused. "I don't care if it embarrasses you. You earned it." Her cries turned into angry sputtering, but Nick hung up before she could say anything else. He had no intention of listening to her excuses anymore. Let her stew in it. When the divorce hearing finally came, Hannah and her lawyer tried everything to paint Nick as the villain. She claimed he was a bad provider, emotionally distant, even mentally abusive. The accusations were laughable, if they weren't so pathetic. The judge wasn't buying it. "I'd remind you, Mrs. Carter," the judge said with an edge in his voice, "that false testimony under oath is a punishable offense." That statement came after they caught Hannah in a lie about their finances. When it was Nick's lawyer's turn, Laura Cleary presented the evidence. Photos, videos, timestamps, everything. It wasn't just a strategy. She laid the facts out with the force of a hammer slamming down onto a table, daring anyone to challenge her. The judge's expression was priceless as the evidence poured in. By the time Laura finished, Hannah looked like she wished she could disappear into the floor. The ruling was exactly what Nick had hoped for. The divorce was granted, and Hannah's plea for alimony was rejected outright. The judge gave Nick 30 days to collect his things from the house, but other than that, he was free. Walking out of that courtroom felt like stepping into the sunlight after years of being trapped in darkness. But it wasn't over yet. About a month later, Nick went back to the house to gather the last of his belongings. As he pulled into the driveway, the sight of the black sedan parked there stung for a moment. That car had been a symbol of the life he had left behind. But in the end, it was just an annoyance now. Hannah wasn't home, so Nick took the boxes and left without a word. A week later, he received a message from her. "Can we talk?" it read. Against his better judgment, Nick agreed to meet her at the same cafe where he had served her the divorce papers. When she walked in, he barely recognized her. The confident, put-together woman he had married was gone. In her place was someone who looked tired, worn out, and broken. "Nick," she began, her voice shaky. "I've made so many mistakes. I don't know what I was thinking. I miss you. I miss us." She went on like that for a while, talking about how hard her life had been since the divorce, how she regretted everything, how she wanted another chance. Nick sat quietly, sipping his coffee and letting her ramble on. He didn't need to say much. When she finally stopped, he set his cup down and looked her dead in the eye. "Hannah," he said, his voice steady and resolute, "I hope you figure things out. I really do. But I've moved on, and there's no going back." Her face fell, but Nick didn't feel any remorse. The old Hannah, the one he'd once cared for, had been a figment of his past. The woman in front of him was a shadow, and she wasn't worth going back to. After that meeting, life for Nick only improved. He focused on himself, diving into new job opportunities, exploring hobbies he'd put on hold, even going on a few dates here and there. Meanwhile, Hannah's life began to spiral. Her relationship with the other guy, the one she had turned to in the aftermath of their divorce, didn't last. It turned out he was a drug dealer who eventually got arrested. Hannah got caught up in his mess, facing charges for possession and DUI. Nick learned all of this through her mother, who still occasionally kept in touch. Her mom even apologized for the way they'd treated him during the divorce and invited him to her husband's funeral when he passed away. Nick went, not for Hannah's sake, but because her mother had always treated him with decency and respect. At the funeral, seeing Hannah was a moment of bitter confirmation. She was a pale shadow of her former self, broken and hollow. In that moment, Nick realized that he had truly won. Not because her life had fallen apart, he didn't take pleasure in that, but because he had walked away stronger, smarter, and completely free from the wreckage she had caused. Revenge, Nick realized, isn't always about destruction. Sometimes, it's about survival. It's about thriving in the aftermath of the mess others have made. And that was exactly what he had done. Chat.